Hello and welcome to today's Explainer. Okay, let's dive right into this. When you think of a bank, you probably picture this massive, heavy physical vault, right? Thick steel doors, really complex locking mechanisms, and stacks of cash guarded by people who look like they eat nails for breakfast. But today, the absolute most valuable asset a commercial bank holds isn't paper money at all, it's data. We've totally transitioned from physical vaults to modern, invisible digital ones. And while we all kind of know what a bank robbery looked like back in the 1920s, figuring out how we measure the security of these modern digital vaults is just a whole new frontier.
Which brings us to a really fascinating question. How do you actually audit a digital bank vault? I mean, if you're a banking regulator or an investor looking at a physical vault, auditing is, well, relatively straightforward. You open the door, you count the cash, you check the thickness of the steel. Done. But auditing digital cloud infrastructure, or assessing the risk of a new mobile banking app, or determining just how vulnerable a system is to a remote access attack, that requires a completely different approach. You can't just physically look at the data. You need a standardized way to measure those invisible defenses and, frankly, a way to count the times those defenses fail.
Let's move to our roadmap and see how this builds. We'll be going through Section 1, the modern digital vault. Section 2, SASB data security metrics. Section 3, counting the breaches. Section 4, managing cyber threats. And finally, Section 5, the bottom line. Okay, Section 1, the modern digital vault. Let's look at what's really at stake here. The entire landscape of commercial banking has fundamentally shifted, and we've got to understand the high stakes of this environment before we can even talk about measuring its security. The source material is incredibly clear on this. Ensuring personal financial data privacy and security isn't just a nice-to-have, it is an absolute, essential responsibility for commercial banks. Why? Because the growth in mobile banking and cloud storage has been literally explosive. More and more banking operations are entirely technology and internet dependent now. So failing to safeguard customer data doesn't just mean some temporary IT headache. No, it leads directly to decreased revenue and a catastrophic loss of consumer confidence. In today's landscape, a single weak password can be more devastating than a stick of dynamite on a vault door.
Moving on to Section 2, SASB data security metrics. Here's where we get into the standardized ledger.
So if data security is this critical to a bank's very survival, how do stakeholders know what's actually going on behind the scenes? Well, to figure that out, we look to the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB standards, which are now part of the IFRS Foundation. This framework gives everyone a specific, structured way to report sustainability-related risks, and that absolutely includes data security in the financial sector. Think of it like the ultimate nutritional label for a bank's digital health. It shows investors exactly what risks could impact the bottom line, their cash flows, or their access to finance over the short, medium, or long term.
Now, what's really interesting about this is when you look at the actual reporting grid that commercial banks use. Right there at the top under Data Security, you're going to find two specific metric codes, FNCB 230A.1 and FNCB 230A.2. This is the exact reporting framework that forces banks to put their cards on the table. It takes the incredibly complex, highly technical world of cybersecurity and neatly translates it into two distinct categories of information that investors and regulators can actually digest and compare.
And those two codes, they represent a brilliant dichotomy that gives us a super useful mental model. On one side, we have the quantitative metrics. These are your hard numbers. They tell us exactly what has happened in the past when it comes to data breaches. Then, on the other side, we have the qualitative metrics. That's the discussion, the analysis. It's the behind-the-scenes narrative of how banks are actively identifying vulnerabilities and managing future risks. You really can't just have one or the other. You need both the raw data of past incidents and the strategic narrative for the future to truly understand a bank's overall security posture.
Which brings us to Section 3, counting the breaches. Let's look at the quantitative side of things.
Welcome to the sharp, serious, and quantitative side of the SASB standard. When things go wrong, what exactly do banks have to disclose? Well, under code FNCB 230A.1, they can't just hide behind vague PR speak, like, we experienced a cyber incident. Nope, they have to provide three core hard numbers for the reporting period. First, the total number of data breaches. Second, the percentage of those breaches that were specifically personal data breaches. And third, the total number of unique account holders affected. It's a beautifully simple but ruthlessly revealing set of metrics. It forces the bank to put a hard number on the total breaches, detail exactly how many of those expose personal customer data, and tell us how many unique customers actually took the hit.
But to make sure everyone is playing by the exact same rules, the standard lays out some very strict definitions. A data breach is defined as an unauthorized occurrence on or conducted through an entity's information systems that jeopardizes their confidentiality, integrity, or availability. And this covers the whole shebang, physical or virtual infrastructure. But what I found genuinely fascinating in these rules is the caveat about encrypted data. So if a bank's encrypted data is stolen, they might think, hey, we're safe. But the standard states that if the encryption key was also acquired, or, and this is key, if there's a reasonable belief the data could be readily converted back to plain text, yeah, that still counts as a breach and absolutely must be reported.
The standard then draws a really clear line between a general data breach and a personal data breach. A personal data breach specifically involves the accidental or unauthorized access to or loss of personal data. And personal data, that's defined as any information relating to an identified or identifiable living individual. Even just various pieces of seemingly random information which, when you collect them together, can identify a person, that constitutes personal data. This distinction is absolutely vital. I mean, a breach of a bank's internal memo system is bad, sure, but a breach that exposes the identities and financial details of actual living individuals, that is a catastrophic threat to that consumer confidence we talked about earlier.
Now, is there a loophole? Well, the only way a bank gets a free pass on reporting a breach is if they can definitively prove two things. This exemption applies if the bank has a reasonable and supportable belief that the occurrence poses absolutely no risk of damage to the entity's business performance and it poses no risk of economic or social disadvantage to individuals. Both of those must be true. Oh, and furthermore, banks are allowed to delay their disclosure, but only if a law enforcement agency officially determines that immediate notification would impede an active criminal investigation. Section 4. Managing Cyber Threats. How banks are preparing for tomorrow.
So that's how we count the damage. But what about preventing it? This is where we look at the qualitative metrics under FNCB 230A.2, adopting a much more forward-looking analytical approach. Because let's face it, numbers alone don't tell the whole story. The SASB standard requires a detailed discussion and analysis from the banks. It's not just about installing firewalls. They have to narratively describe how they actually identify information system vulnerabilities in the first place. They have to explain how they train the human element, how they handle internal controls, and how they leverage tech to manage risks. Plus, banks must discuss the observed trends they are seeing, the origin and frequency of attacks against them. And finally, they have to lay out exactly what their protocol is for telling you when things go wrong in a timely manner.
To truly prove that they're actively managing these digital vaults, banks must specifically discuss their efforts related to new and emerging cyber threats. And the standard actually lists exactly what these modern bank robbers' tactics look like. Banks have to address vulnerabilities popping up from platforms like mobile banking, near-field communication or NFC payments, and web-based banking. They also have to detail their defenses against specific, highly sophisticated attack vectors. We're talking ransomware, complex loan stacking schemes, money mule schemes, and remote access attacks. It basically forces the bank to prove they fundamentally understand the modern battlefield. And this brilliantly illustrates another point. Banks can't just grade their own homework. They are required to describe the degree to which their security approach actually aligns with major external cybersecurity frameworks or applicable jurisdictional laws. They have to map their internal defenses to rigorous, globally recognized frameworks, like the NIST cybersecurity standard or the incredibly strict New York State financial laws. It's a way of proving to everyone that their digital vault is actually built to recognized, rigorous industry code.
Finally, Section 5. The bottom line. Why these metrics actually matter.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from counting data breaches all the way to dissecting ransomware defenses. But let's zoom back out to the big picture for a second. Why do these highly specific accounting metrics matter to you, to the market, and to the future of banking in general? Well, it all comes back to this core idea right from the SASB standard itself. Enhanced disclosure on management strategies to address these risks may permit shareholders to understand how commercial banks are protecting shareholder value. You see, the quantitative hard numbers of data breaches, when combined with the qualitative strategies for managing cyber threats, aren't just bureaucratic red tape. They are the essential tools we use to measure trust. If a bank cannot protect customer data, it loses consumer confidence. If it loses consumer confidence, it loses revenue, directly destroying shareholder value. These metrics are the bridge between invisible digital risks and very, very real financial outcomes. Which leaves us with this final thought. As the banking industry continues to evolve and relies more and more heavily on cloud architecture and mobile tech, the threats are only going to become more sophisticated. The physical vaults of the past, they're basically obsolete.
completely replaced by a digital battlefield. By forcing real transparency through these rigorous data security metrics, we finally get to look under the hood. So the next time you think about where your financial data lives, ask yourself, when you look at the ledger, is your digital vault truly secure, or is it just an illusion of safety? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the right questions.